Thank you, Dennis.
Forward, back, and a pointer.
Okay, all right, good. Should be able to handle that. I'll screw it up 2 or 3 times. Well, intimidated to say the least with a topic such as this. I look back there and Don, Orr, and Hans, I haven't seen you, but a lot of expertise in China, far beyond in terms of my involvement in China, but I appreciated the invitation anyway. Then, yes, I've been going to China now for a couple times a year for the last, 12, 14 years. Talking with Donna, he doesn't leave for China until this next Thursday, I think, before he heads out again to China. So spending a lot of time over there. And I think we've all three obviously developed a lot of opinions over that period of time and have been able to see this consolidation that's taking place in the industry. And just opening, I'll do the summary first. If you look at the commercialization and the consolidation of the swine industry in China, it's progressed very much on the same pattern that we have in the United States. But so much of what they do in China is telescoped of the timeline of getting some of these things done that now that they're playing catch up in terms of worldwide production. They went through the toughest times, the restrictions of the Great Leap Forward, and then the second attempt to get more food produced was the Cultural Revolution. But once they were eliminated, the entrepreneurial spirit in China really took over, and millions of families got into the act of feeding pigs. And they went from marginal levels to 6 times what we produce today. And part of that is that now, when you talk about the consolidation, with the job opportunities in town, in factories, in 48-hour weeks, 48-hour weeks, working 6 days a week, it's not as much fun to go home and try to raise pigs at the same time. And so you're seeing more specialization, more consolidation taking place. So that's the scenario with which we are working. Aha, hit right from the first time. Put things in perspective a little bit. We look at the two countries. We're almost identical in size. Actually, we're about 2%, a little over 2% larger than China in the actual area of the country. But if you look at the amount of arable land, there's where a tremendous difference begins to come into play, because we have approaching 25% more arable land than they have in China. And if you back that, okay, what is a percent arable in each of the countries? Again, about 18% for us, about 14 or 15% for China. With the importance of aquaculture, I was able to pull up this statement on the coastline. Again, we have some advantages. We have about 37% more coastline around the United States than they have around China for taking aquaculture out of the oceans per se. In digging up this information, one other fact I came across that struck me: we have 2 bordering countries around the U.S., Canada and Mexico. I had no idea there are 17 countries border on China. I don't know if that has anything to do with food, but I thought that was a very intriguing number as such. Population, well, they just have about 1 million more people than we have. Yeah, about 1 billion more people than we have here in the U.S., and they're doing that, feeding it on about 6 times the number of pigs, but still there's opportunity for more pigs being produced in China as such. Give you a little chance to study this graph. It's thank goodness we have the monitors back there, because I'm sure you can't see all these numbers, but you look at China from a satisfying the food standpoint. Food accessibility has been a problem periodically for centuries in China. They've gone through several periods. Parents and grandparents of people that the 3 of us that I mentioned have worked with have seen starvations in their own family. I can remember riding with some CEOs of feed companies in their Mercedes, and they're pointing out that, yes, I've had grandfathers that had starved to death back in the area that was the toughest, and we'll talk about that in a moment. and with fire in their eyes saying, we will not starve again. And I truly believe that will not happen again. And yet, if you look at China, as dependent as they are on swine, and we want to look at the one ingredient particularly up here in a minute, there is a lot of emphasis on swine, and I want to go back all the way to 1951, where this picks up, and everything is based on 51 production for these particular items. I'm not going to have you look at all of these, but I want to trace on about 4 of them. If we're looking here at grain production, now going back to 51 through 58, they had the severe starvation here that we'll mention here in a moment. Brought about the Great Leap Forward. They next came forward with a program called the Cultural Revolution, and that's where they brought, they moved people, displaced people around the country. I won't say at random, but well out of their expertise areas, and that was a disaster as well. But I want to concentrate again on grain. And if you go out here to 1975, and I presume there wasn't probably very good records prior to that in China, but when the records get better here, get better over here from here on, notice if you're looking at grain production from 75 through 97, really not much change. Let's look at oil bearing crops. Get my triangles found here. Okay, it's this colored one right here. There was a little increase in soybeans, which would be the main part of that oil over that extended period of time, but not compared with some of the opportunity. Now, let's move up to the other extreme. These are very important from a feeding standpoint, but if you look over here, this would be, meat, but in reality, that is pork, because there's not much beef and mutton consumed in comparison to pork. But look at the increase in pork production as you went from 75 to 97. The only ones higher than that would be aquaculture here, and finally this would be fruit. So it's a high-value products that really took off after there were these changes within the government in terms of the communes, and eventually going back to the decollectivization that they talk about. Put things in perspective. Chairman Mao died in 1976. And once they had the change of leadership, Deng Xiaoping is the one that led them out of this. And the first thing that he did was to go back to decollectivization, privatizing the farms, once again back to the original owners. And things really began to take off, particularly in the animal side of it, much more than the plant side of it. Now, the interesting dichotomy. How did they get this kind of increase in meat production with so meager increases in corn and soybean production? So keep that in mind as we move on through our screens here. I also want to point out in this 58 to 62 period, how severe was that? You see different estimations, but the true famine that was so serious in China, there's estimates that from 35 to 42 million people died. They have a term for it, not unexpectedly, but did not put a cause on it, but nonetheless it was starvation. Most people agree that in that 4-year period from 58 to 62, there were again, estimates as many as 42 million. That's an unbelievable number. And that was the time after the Great Leap Forward first came about. When the Great Leap Forward came about, and then 6 years later they had the Cultural Revolution, which probably actually aggravated their problems, because they now had bookkeepers out producing corn. They really mixed up the population, and it really didn't improve their eventual capability of feeding themselves until Deng Xiaoping came in after Mao's death and instituted putting the farmers back into their own ownership. And that did indeed change, and that's where you begin to see these increases out here. Very slow in the grain, but very rapid in the meat production sector. Now I want to think of the graph you just saw in terms, let's think of meat for a moment, or the high value products here. And this curve follows almost identically the production of pigs, of fish, of fruit, etc. Nothing was happening back here until, again, after the change in the government that decollectivized, and then it began to get a chance to take off, and then you know what's happened in the last decade or so. I'm going to go back to this number. In 1951, the total gross domestic product in China was about 67 billion RMBs. Well, that means that's about $10 billion was the size of that total country's GDP at that point in time. Nothing was happening until things got privatized, entrepreneurship had an opportunity, and it has taken off exceedingly well. Let's look at another GDP calculation. On a worldwide basis, looking at the log of the GDP compared to the log of per capita meat consumption, there's a pretty straight line calculated relationship between the two. Worldwide, that has happened for centuries and continues to happen today, that as the economy goes up, the consumption of meat, milk, and I think you could put eggs in that as well. It wasn't in the reference that I had, but okay, just meat and milk, if that's the way you want to look at it. You can see how people with increased income have the chance to feed their families better than they had previously. And when given that opportunity, we benefit from that in the meat sector. Now, I want to go back and think about the concept of all that increase in pork production and yet so little increase in feed. And I think there's a reason for that that begins to come out as we look at this particular table. And again, use your screens back there, because I'm sure you can't see those that far back into the room. But the thing that comes out of this is for those that are marking from 1 to 9 pigs per year, there are 101 million farms in China that in 2004 was producing that number of pigs, and that constituted 94%, quote, of the producers, and they were producing over half the hogs in China on farms with less than 10 pigs per farm. Now, to take that to the other extreme then, above 50,000 pigs back in 2004, there were 30 farms, and so the size of 50,000 per year was less than 0.4% of all the pigs raised in China. So the large units, small impact, large impact from the 1 to 9. Let's put that in perspective. There were practically more hog producers in China in 2004 than there were hogs being raised in the United States. Put that in perspective in terms of the change. Now, consolidation, sure, they're playing catch up big time. Come down and looking where we were in the U.S. at that point in time, 2004. We don't have a category really less than 1,000. But even there, of our 70,000 producers at that time, 59,950 were under 1,000, but they only accounted for 1% of the production. Quite different than China. Conversely, in 2004, we had farms of 500,000 or more, 25 such farms producing 40%. Okay, that's, again, what's beginning to happen in China, and we'll have proof of that here in a moment as well. Don't know where that came from, Scott. Okay, that's where I was. Yep. And I want to point out in terms of proof of the reduction, here is a graph. I'm sure you've seen this. It's gotten used a lot over the last decade. In 1977, we had someplace approaching 700,000 hog producers. Look at that decline that we've gone through. So in that 30 years roughly, we have replaced, eliminated 90% of our producers. That is happening in China today. Now, I don't know why that's pulled out of the text for some reason. Anyway, I have the final, I have the top and the bottom, but it's the middle that's escaped. Okay, I'll figure this out here. Now let's skip ahead. That was 2004 we looked at before. Now looking at 2008, and the point I wanted to make is that in 2008, the 12 farms that should be on this list here constituted 261,000 sows, not pigs, but sows in the large 12 operations in China. Now, just 3 years later, that number has increased to over, almost 700,000 sows. That increase in a 3-year period of consolidation. Buying a lot of farms, and of course, the Smithfield of China would be the Wins family farms. That they're now up to 1/3 sows in their operations across the country. But the other 9 that are not on there for whatever reason, not as large certainly as the Wins farm, but scaled down to still in the multiple thousand. In fact, of the top 12 in that list, there's only 1 that's had a reduction in that 3-year period. Okay, now let's make the point even stronger on garbage feeding in this case, is what this boils down to. Because if you look at the pigs, and this table was put together looking at commercial versus no commercial feed. And whether you're looking at swine, poultry, or dairy, the commercial feed, those receiving any commercial feed, was the way it was written, I take their word for it, 40% in case of swine, 30% in case of poultry and dairy, or 60% getting no commercial, I think I said that right, no commercial feed versus 70 in the other 2 locations. Okay, that uses a lot of the garbage, and we'll say a little bit more about that before we finish up. I guess one of those is right here. It's been estimated by Informa Economics that puts out a newsletter on a periodic basis on China and other places. But it talks about the fact of the feed capability and the fact that there's about 60 million metric tons annually of garbage, non-consumable human products go into the swine trade. And it's interesting, in that same article they point out that the Chinese producers estimate that typically it'll take them 3 months longer to finish out pigs if they're being fed garbage as to those that are not being fed garbage. You know, we think back of when hogs were going to market at 10, 11, 12 months of age, we didn't have very good nutrient control. And that's what they're looking at here, is that extra 3 months or such. Moving from that then, if we're moving to larger units, more responsible for using complete feeds, diets formulated as we would here in the U.S., this is moving to quite a growth of the feed industry of China. And here's a graph that makes that point beyond that last table of production, because now we're up starting with 2007 here. And if you look at what's happening in terms of feed manufacturing in China, going from 2007 up to 11, that's a 37% increase in manufactured feed in China. And those of us that do travel there a fair amount, not surprised that the number is of that magnitude. Put that in perspective, if you look at our production in the U.S., we're at about 118 million, and we have vacillated from 118 to 125 million in this same time period. So they have passed us in terms of feed production now, but darn it, they should in terms of producing 6 times as much pork as we are. and it is dominated by pork and not that much cattle feed per se. Cattle, for the most part, go to market at 3 years of age in China. If you talk about the feed, what feed? They don't get much feed other than what they get out of the grasses and pastures of China. Okay, corn is very important to the Chinese, obviously. They are the second largest producer of corn in the world. As a matter of fact, they are now becoming our largest customer of buying corn worldwide. This happens to be northern China. It probably looks more like Iowa, northern Iowa, southern Minnesota in terms of rolling plains and hills, of seeing the large corn acreages there. Quite different than the paddy or the small patches you tend to see in the south or the southwest of China. And that happened to be up in Heilongjiang province, clear up in north. In fact, that's on north of Harbin, about another 50 mile. This is Mike Lemon hiding in the cornfield, but wanted to get that picture because it points out that the genetics of the corn in China, at least, and that was taken probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, is to produce the longer, taller plants. We are shortening the plants in the U.S., and that's not going into silage. So that is for hog and poultry production. But again, the genetics they were using, it points out that difference. And I've never figured out this striping that you saw in that first picture. You see the same sort of striping now between the corn and the soybeans and all of that up in Heilongjiang province. Now, looking at corn from a lot of different ways, if we talk about simply the production of corn, that would be the top line here. Consumption would be, you can hardly see this green line that is increasing again on a linear basis as you go from, in this case, 07 and 08, well, no, that goes back to 86 and 87 all the way up to the present. The reason I want to bring in this graph, and we'll talk about it a couple different times during the talk, is that now if you look at the stalks, the supply of corn, all of a sudden that stalks is beginning to fall off because with their greatest efforts, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, in spite of all their attempts to stockpile corn for, in cases of a drought year, this year for instance, but that is falling off. Their ability to maintain that kind of stocks is something they can't do today. And as I say, we will talk about that a little bit later as we finish up here. Now, I want to get into, in terms of, we've talked about the growth. One of the problems that happens in China is that they're doing a fabulous job of learning how to raise and produce more corn, but there are still some gaps that need to be filled in, and I want to mention some of that, and I guess example is the best way of showing this. Now, you can, that too is a different picture, Scott. I'm not sure what's coming next. The corn bins there to the right, as fine as quality of storing corn as you will find any place in the U.S. in terms of getting it dried properly, getting it stored properly, getting air putting through it, keeping the moisture down. That's a large plant down in Guangdong province. Here, moving straight west of there out into Yunnan province, which would be southwestern China, you see a lot of corn, and this is historic way of handling the corn. You harvest the ears, you hang them up to dry someplace in a convenient spot where they get plenty of air, but a lot of birds, a lot of insects, and the whole 9 yards there. So that it's not an effective way of storing corn long term, but yet it talks about some of the variation that you see. Or you can get into various ethnic groups, and this would be straight north of there up in Sichuan province. And we're missing some of the picture here, but you can see corn being stored here, and there's, if it were to back up here a little bit, you would find considerably more corn tied up here in the same way that you saw in that last one, except this is more in a community while the other was in a private residence as such. But unfortunately, historically, there's still a lot of corn in China that gets stored in this fashion, right out in the open, subject to moisture, winds, rain, snow, whatever, because a lot of this is going to be in northern China. This is in northern China. The storage of the corn, and you can imagine the rodent-infested activity that you're going to have in a site like this. There's that kind of variation that the producers further south in China have to deal with in terms of acquiring corn. So that becomes an ongoing problem that we'll address here in a moment. And that's also confounded by the way that I shouldn't say much of the corn, a lot of the corn is still is still dried using solar energy, namely the sun shining down on the corn that's spread on the city parks and the barnyards, on the city streets. It may be blocked off with logs and you better drive around them. You're not going to be able to drive across those logs, so you'll find the city streets closed down with corn piled just as it is there, 3 or 4 inches deep, and somebody goes through with a rake once a day. Now, you can get corn to come down in moisture, no question. If you're going from 30% down to 20%, heck, that's a lot more efficient, economical, may not be efficient, a lot more economical way of doing that. But you're not going to get down to the below 15% that we demand literally for the storing of our grain. So with that, you have the problem, the opportunity and the problem from that of molds growing, as we'll talk about here in a minute. Now, I've been lobbying in China for some period of time that this is one of the screens, and some of the screens you see going through are simply screens I picked out of some of the presentations made in China, and pointing out this is a U.S. operation drying on the left, and pointing out the dryer up there. But I've been lobbying that what China needs, where you have a lot of these neighbors with maybe small acreages, it's all hand shucked as corn, what they ought to be doing is to either building or importing little portable dryers, and a half a dozen farmers could go together, buy such a dryer, and just kind of rotate on a weekly, during the week, so it gets around all of these farms in a short period of time. I've been totally unsuccessful. I don't know of anybody that has done this, but I still think it's a great improvement over using the city streets and not getting the job done properly even there. So mold does become a very serious problem in China. And again, it's because of the storage, the ventilation, the poor buildings. I've seen bins that simply have paper up on top as a way of keeping out the moisture in the wintertime. Obviously, that doesn't work either. Now, here's one that 10 years ago I'd have never even considered putting this on my list of problems within China. This is a very severe problem in China. In the U.S., yes, we recognize you're going to have bugs, insects, whatever, in your granaries, and we effectively clean those out, sweep them out, vacuum them out, and then come in with a spray of some type to minimize any growth. That doesn't happen in China, and it needs to in the worst way. And this came home to roost in visiting in a particular area where they wanted to show me how they stored their corn, and it was a Quonset that's as long as this classroom is long. It was a 20-foot high Quonset, stacked from floor to ceiling on either side of the walkway down the center with bags of corn. We went out there probably 1:30 in the afternoon, had lunch, and we were going to stop and see how they stored their corn. They never totally emptied it out, but it was all in bags, so they thought, okay, we're cleaning it out while we're replacing the bags. We walked into that building, and it got about 10 or 15 feet in the building. Dumb Harmon says, gee, I didn't think it looked like rain. What's he talking about? I swear, having grown up under a metal roof in a home that we had when I was a kid, I knew what it sounded like when rain was hitting a roof hard when you had a hard rain. That's exactly the way it sounded inside of that bin. Now imagine the billions of weevil consuming that corn, emptying it out, and as I tell them in China, well, A weevil infestation is going to be about the same as you have in a product called DDGS after you've sucked the starch out of the DDGS. And that's what you're ending up with here. And so it's a serious problem. If you're talking about the quality control issues, that's one of them that needs to be addressed. Rodents, obviously, again, a very serious problem in the Far East. They've not been willing in so many cases to spend the money that we take seriously in the U.S. Again, this is a screen right out of one of my presentations, and one of them is that worldwide is estimated that 1 out of every 5 kilo of feed is destroyed by rodents. And again, just as with the weevil, it's not just the rodents and their actual destruction of the nutritional value. It's probably one of the worst vectors that we have for transmitting diseases, which again, are a far greater problem in China. You're storing a bin out there, there's no way you're keeping the rodents out of this facility. And I even point out to them that I don't care whether you've got a hog farm or whether you're Costco and everything in between, including every restaurant. I point out that you're going to have these little boxes spread at every door around the building, or every 30 feet around the building if you want to just go around the actual perimeter. But in reality, if you wanted a symbol for the poor use of biosecurity, nothing tells that story better than this picture right here. That boar is delivering a lot more than semen in that community that boar is working in day after day. I think it would be a good symbol of what we need to do. 50 million ton of feed is wasted every year in China because it's destroyed and not made of value to the animals. But it doesn't stop there, because there's also a national grain strategic reserve that was put in by Chairman Mao way back in the Great Leap Forward that forces individual farmers to store grain for 2 or even 3 years. I think the 3 years is going to the wayside, but 2 years. Can you imagine the quality left in that corn from your micronutrients that's been in storage for 3 years? We would be very hesitant to. Guess who has to use that? The pig and poultry producers. And now I find out, when I got to digging into this, that there's also a same sort of thing for the pork. They have a pork reserve as well, and they actually say it's to minimize the populace unrest because of high prices. And that's probably a pretty fair statement. I want to go back to this because I want to concentrate on this as I finish up here. I think when we got started, I think you give me a 5 minute? Okay, I'm okay? 5 minutes? Okay. Come back to this issue of the drop-off of the corn in storage starting about 2001, and it's getting worse. I think this is going to take care of the forced storage of corn that farmers have had to maintain over years. And I've pointed out to them, Japan was in that same position about 1951, and they decided they could replace growing corn by putting out televisions and automobiles. They've done it pretty darn well. And of course, China is now in the midst of doing that. So I think there's less concern today because this is happening than there would have been even a decade ago. Because with all the widgets that we're buying out of China today, there's a lot of money obviously going back into China. They can buy corn better than we can. Now, the thing that's changing. We're getting to the act just as we've been into the act in soybeans of being a major shipper of soybeans to China. If you go back to 2005 and look at the importation of corn into China, it bounced around up and down until 2009, looks like maybe getting serious, and then finally in the last 2 years it has gotten darn serious. Because look at the jump in the importation of corn, and look who has also gotten into the act, because now we're providing from 94 to 95% of the corn that's going into China as importations into China. Again, the changing dynamics of China, and it's estimated that, I don't know what this drought is going to do in the price of corn, but if you go back into May and June, you were seeing reports that they were estimating that in 2012, we're there, that it might be as high as 4 million, going from 1.5 up to 4 million, or I've even seen as high as in 13, it might be at 13 million. Again, we don't know what's going to happen based on the pricing. U.S. corn now is a standard commodity, and in China, this is the way U.S. corn is stored inside closed buildings, and I think sustaining the quality better than had been done in many of the other situations. I want to close up just in talking about the feed mills in China. There are 14,000 registered feed production factories, mills, whatever you want to call them, in China. I got chastised jokingly one night because, again, I've been going enough now that probably maybe get a little more critical of some things happening over there than maybe I should. But I said, 14,000 people making feeds, I'm not sure that's the most efficient or effective in getting good products. In fact, I said 13,000. Well, that night we were having a dinner, and an assistant minister of agriculture was there, and he said, Dr. Harmon, you need to upgrade that number. We just went over 14,000. So, again, they're still growing in number of operations. Now, they may be backyard, they may be basements, they may be back porch operations with single ingredients, but nonetheless, it's happening. A lot of consolidation taking place in the feed manufacture, and I'm not sure I can pull up those numbers quickly enough, but it's amazing how China has gone from government-owned feed companies to privately owned, and they're being bought out. And the swine producers, poultry producers are ecstatic that these are being bought out, and they will say it's because of the attitude differences between the government-owned feed companies and the private-owned. So what's new? In terms of the equipment, because I'm not an engineer, but I'm impressed with the equipment that I see as I go through Chinese feed plants. And of course, in having to clean out the pellet mill, happens there as well as it does here. But also, you'll see a mixture of maybe some hand labor in there as well. That particular day, their power unit wasn't working, so these guys were moving their feed about within the mill. This was in the mill with manual labor. Hog buildings, China has gone through various attempts to build unique, different, individual ideas, individualized hog facilities. Here's one that's more than 1 kilometer long and maybe 20 feet wide, whatever that number is. The early units in China failed to take into account biology, microbiology, some of the things that we've been talking about from a biosecurity standpoint. And this may be very advantageous for like a cattle feedlot that you can drive along with a wagon. No, that's not going to work in a hog unit from a biosecurity standpoint, but I can't imagine having one building that was over 1 kilometer long as this building is. Here's my favorite one, though, in China. This is a unit that I think it's 5 or 6 stories tall. I forget, I have to count them each time because I don't remember. And it looks like the Indianapolis airport when you get from floor 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 with feet or whatever. And I will guarantee you, knowing what other things about those buildings, no way would I want to take a truck up through here and expect that it's going to happen year after year, because sooner or later it was going to fall down. I was always wondering about why it didn't. This unit never, well, let me show you further. This is the way the whole building, this series of these that were in operation, I'll go back now so that you can see it better. The only money they really made in this operation was they put a water tank up here as insulation. This is in the Hangzhou area, so it's middle China. That they put this water, well, I'll call it a tank, but it's an insulation of about a couple feet deep. Somebody got the idea of raising turtles, and they were turning out, I think, 1.4 million turtles a year out of this unit. And that was the only place that they were actually making any money within the unit. And I think with that, we better wind it down. Thank you.